In a time before refrigerators, freezers, and grocery stores, winter survival was an art form, deep within the cool, dim cellars of medieval villages. Families stored the fruits of their labor grains sealed in barrels, meats cured in salt, and roots resting in woven baskets. The air smelled faintly of earth and smoke, a reminder of the seasons past and the long months still to come. Tonight, we'll step into that world, a world where planning for the cold was not just wise, but essential, where the slow, careful management of food could mean the difference between hunger and health. Settle in, and let us walk through the quiet skill of the winter keepers. Story 1. A Winter Without Salt. How medieval food preservation shaped survival. You were a farmer in medieval Europe. The first frost was not simply a sign of winter, it was a countdown clock. The moment the air began to smell of wood smoke, and the fields turned brittle with frost, your mind would turn to your stores. This was not a time when food could be easily bought in abundance during winter. There was no modern transport to bring oranges from Spain or grains from Egypt. Your survival depended on what you had managed to preserve from the harvest. And one substance, above all, determined whether your household would make it through the season: salt. Salt was not merely a seasoning, it was the foundation of preservation. Without refrigeration, food quickly spoiled, even in cold weather. Meat, especially, required salting or smoking to last. A fresh kill in November could become inedible by December without proper preservation. Fish, grains, vegetables. Cereal had their own methods of storage, but salt was universal. Its ability to draw out moisture and inhibit bacteria was understood not through chemistry, but through centuries of hard-learned experience. The availability of salt was uneven. Coastal regions had easier access to salt from evaporation ponds or boiling seawater, though the labor was grueling and the yield low in winter months. Inland, salt came from rock deposits or brine springs, often under strict control by lords, monasteries, or the crown. In some regions, the salt tax was as significant as land rents, and many families could not afford enough to properly preserve all their meat for the winter. As a result, wealth determined not just comfort, but survival itself. Imagine a small village in late autumn. The last grain harvest has been brought into the barn, and the pigs are being slaughtered for the feast of St. Martin. This feast, in early November, marked a bittersweet moment. It was one of the year's great communal meals, but it also meant the beginning of months without fresh food. Most of the pork would be cut into slabs, rubbed with coarse salt, and hung in the cool, smoky air of the curing room. The stronger the salt, the longer the meat could last, but too much, and it became almost inedibly tough. Peasants learned the balance, though sometimes they erred on the side of too much, knowing that a tough strip of salted pork was better than none at all. Salted fish was even more common, especially in regions far from the sea. Trade routes carried barrels of preserved herring deep into the continent, feeding towns and villages through Lent and other fasting periods when meat was forbidden by the church. The fish was hard and dry by the time it reached inland markets, requiring long soaking to be edible again. Monastic records describe the process in details, sometimes involving a full day of soaking in fresh water, changing the water repeatedly before it could be boiled with onions or greens. The absence of adequate salt in a household's winter supply could lead to a fresh food gamble. Without enough to preserve all the meat, some families tried to keep it fresh in cold cellars or buried in snow. This works. A sudden warm spell could spoil weeks' worth of provisions, forcing the family to slaughter more animals than planned or rely on neighbors for help. That help was not always forthcoming, for in winter, every household guarded its own stores carefully. Grains and legumes required less salt, but still had to be guarded against moisture and vermin. The granary was as important as the hearth. In regions with damp winters, grain could sprout or rot if poorly stored. Rats and mice were constant threats, their numbers swelling as they sought shelter from the cold. Cats were valued for more than companionship, though even a good mouser could not always protect against the loss of a badly sealed sack. Salt also played a role in dairy preservation. Cheesemaking in autumn was one way to store milk for winter use. A well-aged cheese could last for months, its rind hardened by time, and its flavor sharpened by salt. Butter, too, could be salted to extend its life, though in some colder climates, butter kept naturally through the winter without much trouble. In other areas, salt was used to pack butter into earthenware pots, sealing it away from air. In towns and cities, the winter food market was shaped by the salt trade. Merchants brought in salted meats, fish, and sometimes even preserved vegetables in barrels. Wealthy households could buy imported goods, while poorer families relied on local suppliers or their own preparations. Street food in winter often involved hot, salty broths, both for warmth and to provide much-needed sodium to a diet otherwise dominated by bread and thin pottage. The link between salt and survival meant that political control over salt was, in many ways, control over life itself. Kings and princes used salt taxes to fill their coffers. Lords granted monopolies to certain merchants. Monasteries hoarded salt for their own use and for charitable distribution. In some places, salt riots broke out when prices rose too high or supplies ran short. The most famous of these came much later, but the underlying tension was always present in medieval life. Without salt, there could be no secure winter. For you, living in that time, winter began not with the first snow, but with the quiet moment. When you closed the door on the last of the harvest and looked at your stores, you would run your hand over the sacks of grain, count the cheeses stacked in the corner, check the barrels of fish and meat, and weigh in your mind the weeks ahead. Would this be a mild winter, when snow came late and the stores held out easily? Or would it be a harsh one, with frozen roads cutting off trade, or sickness sweeping through the village, forcing neighbors to barter food for care? The salt was your insurance. Without it, you could be forced into desperate choices. Animals too early, trading precious tools for a barrel of fish, or stretching thin soups for weeks on end. It was a small, pale crystal, but it might as well have been gold. And so, as the first hard frost set in and the fields turned silent, you would think of it, perhaps, without realizing just how much your survival rested upon it. But how did medieval communities ensure a steady supply of salt when wars, taxes, and weather could so easily disrupt its flow? To understand how salt reached medieval villages in the dead of winter, you have to picture the geography and the roads as they were met, ruts, and sometimes nothing more than a beaten path between hedgerows. When the weather turned cold and wet, these tracks froze into uneven ridges, or else became impassable with slush. Moving a wagon loaded with barrels of salt was slow, exhausting work for oxen and men alike. In many places, the transport of salt was timed carefully around the seasons. In summer, salt from coastal evaporation ponds could be moved inland more easily, but it risked drawing moisture during humid months, hours, and the constant threat of snow. Some merchants specialized in nothing but salt, building a trade network that spanned counties and sometimes crossed national borders. Salt routes became lifelines. The French route du sel, the German Salstrays, and the English saltways each had their own histories. The men who controlled these routes were not always noble by birth, but their wealth made them powerful. A salt merchant could finance small armies or sway local councils. In certain towns, the salt barons had seats at the very tables where laws were made. Along these routes, storage depots stood like waypoints. Some were nothing more than barns with thick, dry walls. Others were fortified warehouses, guarded against theft. Salt theft was not a petty crime. It could mean death in the depths of winter for the victims. Punishments were severe. Court records from the late Middle Ages tell of thieves branded, whipped, or banished for stealing as little as a few handfuls. You might imagine that salt was a common, humble commodity, but its price was anything but trivial. Inland, far from the coast or salt mines, it could cost more than wine. The price was not only due to scarcity, but also to the many taxes layered upon it. In some kingdoms, each lord along a salt route took his share, forcing merchants to raise prices at every stage. In France, the infamous Gabella government salt tax would later become one of the grievances leading to revolution. But even centuries earlier, smaller, local versions of the gabelle were already shaping who could afford to preserve food. If you were a peasant in a remote village, your supply might come only once or twice a year, and you had to stretch it. The community sometimes pooled resources, buying salt in bulk for multiple households. In that case, the village elders might divide it by weight using simple scales, often made of wood with stones as counterweights. A mistrustful neighbor might watch closely as the scales tipped, ensuring no family received more than their share. In monastic communities, salt was more plentiful. Monasteries often owned land along salt routes or even salt works themselves. The Benedictine rule stressed hospitality, so monasteries needed preserved food year-round for guests and pilgrims. This gave them incentive to secure reliable supplies, and their surplus sometimes made them the de facto suppliers for nearby villages in lean years. Still, monks were not immune to shortages. Chronicles describe winters when even abbeys rationed their stores, doling out only enough for the most essential preservation. The physical movement of salt was also shaped by waterways. Rivers, when not frozen solid, were faster and safer for bulk transport than roads. Barges could carry heavy loads without overburdening oxen, and river tolls were sometimes lower than road tolls. But winter could freeze rivers entirely, halting trade for weeks. The famous winter markets held on the frozen Thames centuries later were partly a result of such freezes, though in the Middle Ages, echoing caverns where workers spent their days in dim light, chipping at glistening walls. In places like Hallstatt in Austria or Wieleczka in Poland, salt was not just scraped from the surface, but carved from deep underground deposits. These mines were dangerous. Collapses, bad air, and flooding were constant threats. Workers emerged, white with salt dust, their skin dried and cracked. But in medieval life, it was a logistical challenge. To get salt from a mine in Austria to a small town in Bohemia in January meant coordination between miners, carters, tollkeepers, warehouse guards, and market sellers. One storm could delay a shipment by weeks, and by the time it arrived, prices might have doubled. For rulers, controlling salt was as strategic as controlling grain. Wars sometimes targeted salt production, directly burning evaporation ponds, blocking trade routes, or seizing mines. The loss of a single salt source could ripple through an entire region's winter survival. Armies in winter campaigns often seized salt stores first, knowing that without it, the local population would struggle to keep food edible until spring. Households adapted in various ways. In years when salt was scarce, preservation methods shifted toward smoking, drying, or fermenting, though each had its limits. Smoked meat lasted only so long, and dried vegetables could lose much of their flavor and nutrition. Pickling in vinegar or brine was another method, but brine itself required precious salt. Fermentation, such as sauerkraut, was a partial solution. It needed less salt than curing meat, but it could not replace the security of a well-salted larder. The poor often turned to creative substitutes, sashes for cleaning, herbs for flavor. But there was no true substitute for salt in preservation. Lack of it not only meant hunger in late winter, it also meant higher risk of disease. Spoiled food carried illness, and weak, underfed bodies were more vulnerable to cold weather sicknesses like pneumonia. In some communities, the annual arrival of the salt merchant was an event. Children might run to meet the cart at the edge of the village, and elders would inspect the crystals for purity. Good salt was dry, white, and free of debris. Inferior salt might be damp, gray, or even mixed with sand to cheat the buyer. To test it, people sometimes dissolved a pinch in water, looking for cloudy residue. When you look at medieval winter through the lens of salt, you begin to see it, not as a simple backdrop of snow and cold, but as a constant negotiation between geography, politics, and biology. Every pinch was part of a chain stretching from miner to merchant to hearth. Still, even with the best supply lines, the question remained: how did households decide what to preserve and how to ration it so that not just by chance they would have enough to eat when the thaw finally came? When the salt was finally in the house, whether it had come from a passing merchant, the monastery's charity, or a summer purchase carefully saved, the real work began, deciding how to use it. Medieval households did not think in terms of recipes so much as in terms of survival months. Each preserved piece of food was measured not against the appetite of the moment, but against the risk of scarcity in March. This planning began immediately after the slaughtering season. In many places, animals were slaughtered in November because it was expensive to feed them through winter when pasture was gone. The fresh meat from those kills would be eaten quickly in feasts and celebrations, but much of it would be salted down in barrels, layered with crystals, until every surface was coated. The barrels themselves mattered. Oak for sturdiness, iron hoops to keep them sealed tight. If the seal failed, moisture could seep in, leading to rot or mold. The process was not a matter of sprinkling salt casually. Entire days could be devoted to packing meat. The salt would be rubbed in, often more than once, and the meat would be rearranged in the barrel after a few days to ensure even penetration. A liquid brine might form naturally as the salt drew moisture from the flesh. In some cases, more brine was added to cover the meat entirely. This meant that even the water for brining had to be carefully chosen clean, fresh, and free from anything that might spoil the batch. Once salted, the meat was stored in the coldest, driest place available of a cellar, though in some regions it might be a smokehouse that also doubled as storage. The cellar was not simply a hole in the ground. It was carefully constructed to control humidity. In damp climates, shelves were raised off the ground and the walls lined with straw to keep out excess moisture. Cheese followed a similar logic. Autumn cheeses, made when milk production began to slow, were often harder and saltier than summer cheeses. These keeping cheeses could survive months in a cool cellar, their flavor intensifying with age. They were not always pleasant to the modern palate, strong, sharp, and sometimes gritty, but they were reliable calories. Salt was critical in this process, not just for flavor, but to slow bacterial growth and mold. The daily rationing of salted foods was almost an art form. Bread and pottage were the staples of most diets, and preserved meat or fish was added sparingly. A family might serve salted fish only once or twice a week, soaking it overnight and boiling it with onions, turnips, or leeks to soften its texture. The resulting broth was valued just as much as the meat. Itself, every drop contained precious salt and nutrients. Even among wealthier households, salt was not wasted. Cooking water from salted meats was reused in soups or to flavor other dishes. If brine from a barrel of fish remained, it might be used to pickle vegetables, extending their shelf life into spring. Nothing was poured away without consideration. Rationing was guided not only by the calendar, but also by the church calendar. Fasting periods like Lent, Advent, and certain saints' days restricted the eating of meat. On these days, salted fish became the default protein, and the demand for it in winter was so steady that it shaped entire trade economies. Monasteries were especially strict, consuming vast quantities of preserved fish, which in turn encouraged better preservation methods and more extensive salt use. Yet, no matter how careful the planning, the danger of running short was ever present. A family might miscalculate if the winter dragged on longer than expected. Illness could force people to eat more for recovery, depleting stores faster. Spoilage caused by a crack in a barrel, an infestation of insects, or a thaw in the cellar could wipe out weeks of food in a matter of days. When shortages came, diets shifted to whatever could be foraged or spared from spring planting. Dried beans, peas, and lentils could fill the gap, though these required fuel to cook another winter resource that had to be rationed. In desperate years, people ground acorns into flour, a bitter substitute for grain. The poorest sometimes survived on thin broths and bread crusts, their health weakening as winter gave way to the cold, damp hunger of early spring. Salt also had a psychological role. In a season when fresh flavors were scarce, the taste of salt could lift a dish from bland to satisfying. A meal of plain pottage might be tolerable, but a sprinkling of salt could make it feel substantial. Chronic lack of salt could dull the appetite, making the meager diet even harder to bear. Modern medicine tells us that sodium is essential for bodily function. Medieval people might not have known the chemical reason, but they knew in their bones that without it, life weakened. In communities fortunate enough to end winter with salt still in the barrel, the arrival of spring brought a subtle shift. Fresh greens began to appear, nettles, sorrel, young leeks and preserved meats were eaten more freely before the heat could spoil them. This was a time of cautious celebration, a recognition that another cycle of survival had been completed. But in the years when the salt ran out early, there was no such relief. Those springs were remembered for the hunger gap, a stretch when the stores were gone, but the new harvest was still months away. Many deaths in medieval Europe did not come in the dead of winter, but in these lean weeks when bodies weakened by months of scant food finally failed. Looking back, it is tempting to imagine that salt in medieval winters was a small matter, a detail among many. But the reality is that it was a linchpin. Without it, the winter economy, domestic, regional, and even political, would have collapsed. Salt allowed people to turn the brief bounty of autumn into a steady, if unvaried, stream of sustenance until the land could provide again. It was, in short, the quiet foundation of survival, unglamorous and unremarked in chronicles unless it was missing. And yet, every time you sprinkle it on your food today, you are echoing the same gesture that meant life or death for countless medieval households. The question, then, is not why salt was important, but why, despite its importance, medieval societies so often let it become scarce, taxed it heavily, or risked its supply in war. Story 2. The frozen river markets. Commerce on ice in the Middle Ages. In a medieval winter, a frozen river was both a blessing and a disruption. For much of the year, rivers were the arteries of trade, carrying barges loaded with grain, salt, wine, and wool between towns. But when the frost gripped hard enough to halt their flow, these same waterways transformed into solid, glittering roads. And sometimes they became marketplaces, temporary, improbable, and entirely dependent on the cold. The idea of a market on a frozen river sounds almost festive to modern ears, perhaps because of later traditions like the frost fairs on the frozen Thames. But in the Middle Ages, the appearance of stalls and trade on ice was rarely about leisure. It was about necessity. When a river froze, the normal traffic of goods was cut off. Merchants who had been waiting to move their wares downstream could not simply wait until the thaw. Their goods needed to be sold, bartered, or used before they spoiled or became financially burdensome to store. The frozen surface provided an unexpected solution. The same path that a barge might take in summer could now be walked directly, without bridges or ferries. Villagers from opposite banks, who normally met only at certain crossing points, could now step onto the ice and meet halfway, spreading their goods out on wooden boards or thick cloths to keep them above the frozen surface. What was traded depended on the region. In Northern Europe, you might find barrels of salted fish, wheels of cheese, smoked meats, and baskets of winter vegetables like turnips and leeks. In more southern climates, where rivers froze less often, the goods were fewer in variety, more often firewood, preserved olives, or grain in sacks. In every case, the items were practical, suited for surviving the remainder of the winter. Of course, the ice was not always entirely safe. People learned to read it listening for the sharp cracking that warned of weakness, testing it with poles before bringing carts onto it. Heavy goods might be pulled on sledges rather than wheeled carts, distributing the weight more evenly. There are accounts from monastic chronicles of markets abruptly ending when a warm wind came, softening the ice and sending both goods and sellers scrambling for shore. The organization of these markets was rarely formal, especially in the earlier Middle Ages. There was no time for charters or official stalls. Traders simply claimed a patch of ice and set up, but as with all commerce, patterns developed. In some places, local lords began charging fees for the right to sell on the ice, just as they did in regular market squares. This could be as simple as a coin handed to a steward, or as elaborate as setting up a rope-off area where only approved merchants could stand. Not every frozen river became a market. The thickness of the ice, the trade importance of the waterway, and the population density along its banks all played a role. A small village river might freeze solid every winter, but see no market because the goods available were too few. By contrast, a wide, slow-moving trade river in a populated region could see hundreds of people gathering when the ice was reliable, turning the frozen channel into a bustling strip of commerce. If you were to walk onto such a river market, you might smell smoke from small braziers where vendors tried to keep warm, hear the crunch of boots on snow, and feel the cold bite sharply at your face. Children would dart between stalls, carrying messages or fetching goods for adults. Dogs would sniff eagerly at baskets of food, and all around, the cold would harden every sound, voices carrying further than usual in the crisp air. The frozen market was not without risks beyond the ice itself. Theft could be easier in such a crowded, open space, especially when goods were laid out on the ground. Disputes over prices could flare quickly in the cold, when tempers shortened and hands stiffened. But the ice also created a kind of neutral ground. On a frozen river, no single village or lord could claim the land beneath their feet, at least not in the minds of the sellers. It was the river's domain, and for a brief time, everyone met there as equals or as close to equals as medieval society allowed. The goods sold on ice were not always the same as those in a summer market. Some merchants saw the frozen market as an opportunity to clear out goods that would not last until spring. Slightly over-cured fish, vegetables beginning to soften, or wool that had been stored too long. Others used it to sell fuel bundles of sticks, peat, or even coal in later centuries directly to households who had miscalculated their winter needs. The immediacy of the frozen market meant that deals could be struck quickly, sometimes at better prices than in town markets, simply because the seller could not afford to carry the goods back. For the people who lived along these rivers, the frozen market became part of their winter rhythm. It might not happen every year, but when it did, it was remembered. The winter, when the river froze so solid we sold cheese on the midstream, or the year the wine casks stood on the ice for a fortnight. These were not just stories of trade. They were stories of adaptation, of making use of whatever the season offered. Yet, the very existence of such markets raises a question. How did medieval people decide when the ice was trustworthy enough to bear the weight of an entire economy, even for a day? Before a medieval frozen river market could come to life, the first question was always the same: is it safe? No one had scientific charts of ice thickness, no printed guide telling them that 4 inches holds a man, 8 inches holds a horse. Instead, they relied on a mixture of experience, observation, and cautious trial. The river's edges were tested first, since the flow there slowed and the ice formed earlier. Men would strike it with poles, listening for the dull, solid sound of thick ice, or the higher, brittle ring that warned of weakness. Some would chip small holes, judging the depth and color of the ice layer, peering into the water beneath. In many places, the first to step fully onto the ice were fishermen. Used to the river in every season, they could read it in subtle ways: the way it bowed slightly underfoot, the faint trickle of water in cracks, the muffled gurgle of current under the frozen skin. If the fishermen declared it safe for their work, others soon followed. Even so, there were gradations of safe. Light foot traffic might be allowed days before carts ventured out. Children, lighter and less cautious, often skated or slid on the ice long before adults trusted it with goods. Horses were the next test, leading one carefully across with an empty sledge before trying with a load. Only when the ice bore this weight without complaint did full market activity begin. Once the ice was deemed trustworthy, the question became where to set up. Markets tended to form at natural crossing points near towns, ferries, or bridges, because people already knew these locations and could reach them easily. The stalls or mats would be laid out along the length of the river, often keeping to the center where the ice was thickest. The market had no walls or roofs, but sellers brought what they could: blankets or planks to set their goods on, low stools, sometimes even small canvas shelters to block the wind. In very cold weather, vendors might dig shallow pits in the snow beside their stall, using them to store goods that needed to stay cold but off the bare ice. The river itself, of course, provided the ultimate cold storage. Fish and meat could be kept there for hours without spoilage. The lords or town officials who oversaw regular markets did not always know how to treat these frozen ones. In some cases, they simply ignored them, seeing them as temporary, informal affairs, not worth the trouble of taxing. In others, they imposed the same rules as in the town market: fees for sellers, weights and measures inspected, and fines for breaking regulations. There are scattered records from the 13th and 14th centuries of toll collectors setting up on frozen bridges to intercept marketgoers and demand payment before they reached the ice. The atmosphere could vary widely from year to year. In milder winters, when the ice might only last a week, markets were hurried, urgent affairs, buyers and sellers scrambling to make deals before the thaw. In severe winters, the market might return day after day for weeks, becoming a kind of outdoor meeting place. People arranged to meet there as they would in the town square, swapping news as well as goods. Not all trade was local. A frozen river could make a previously long journey astonishingly direct. Merchants might take advantage of the ice to cross straight from one bank to the other without the detour of a bridge miles upstream. This was especially useful where rivers meandered. The ice allowed for straight-line travel, saving days in some cases. The market, then, was not just a place for local produce, but sometimes for goods from entirely different regions: wool from upland shepherds, saltfish from distant coasts, even small luxury items like glass beads or fine cloth if a traveling merchant happened to be caught by the freeze. It's worth remembering that the medieval economy was often limited by sheer geography. A frozen river market temporarily rewrote the map, erasing obstacles that in summer could take hours or days to cross. For the duration of the freeze, the river was not a barrier, but a shared space, linking communities that normally kept their distance. But this opportunity also carried risk. The ice was never static. Even in the coldest winters, there were days when the sun's warmth or a shift in current thinned it unexpectedly. There are accounts, rare but haunting, of markets breaking up in panic as the ice groaned and shifted. Beneath hundreds of feet, goods were abandoned, carts overturned, and in some tragedies, people and animals were lost. These dangers were remembered long after, becoming cautionary tales passed down in riverside villages. Still, necessity outweighed fear. If a merchant's storage barn was full of goods that might spoil before the thaw, it made more sense to risk a day on the ice than to lose the entire season's earnings. Likewise, for a family running low on grain or fuel, the chance to buy directly from a supplier even on a frozen surface was worth the danger. In this way, the frozen river market embodied a kind of medieval pragmatism. Use what is there for as long as it lasts, and accept the risks as part of survival. Yet, as with all medieval trade, there was another question lurking beneath the surface. How did people agree on prices in such a fleeting and unpredictable market? In a medieval frozen river market, the question of price was as fluid or as brittle as the ice beneath it. Unlike established town markets, where prices might be influenced by regular supply, seasonal expectations, and the watchful eyes of local officials, the frozen river market operated under an unusual urgency. Sellers knew the ice could last a month or melt tomorrow. Buyers knew that if they walked away without making a deal, they might not see the same goods again until spring. In practice, this meant prices could swing wildly. Had full stocks, prices often reflected normal rates, sometimes even higher, since people were willing to pay for the convenience. But as the days passed, the balance shifted. Sellers with goods prone to spoilage, fish that had been salted too lightly, vegetables beginning to soften, bundles of firewood cut to green might drop prices sharply rather than risk hauling them home. Haggling was common, but it was a different kind of negotiation than in a summer square. The buyer might point out that clouds were warming the day and the ice might not last. The seller might counter that the goods wouldn't be there tomorrow if the ice broke. These conversations happened in the sharp, breath-clouded air, with boots creaking on the frost and fingers stiffening as coins were counted. On a frozen river, there was no permanent stall to hold the official town scale. Sellers brought their own, sometimes just a simple balance beam with lead or stone weights. In some places, a trusted elder or merchant guild member might walk the ice during market hours. In large towns, silver pennies, or their local equivalents, changed hands, but in smaller or more remote communities, barter dominated. A bundle of dried fish might be exchanged for a half sack of grain. A length of woolen cloth might be traded for firewood. The frozen river was, in effect, a giant open-air ledger, where value was agreed upon in the moment and rarely recorded in writing. Luxury goods, while rare, played by different rules. A merchant caught by a freeze with a chest of glass beads, or a few bolts of fine cloth, could charge high prices, both because the items were scarce and because the people who could afford them were less concerned about the cost. These transactions were often quick, discreet, and took place slightly away from the main bustle, not least because luxury items could draw thieves in a setting where escape was only a slip away. For many villagers, the frozen market was also a chance to sell their own surplus. A family with more onions than they could eat, or with a goat that still gave milk in the depths of winter, could set up beside the professional merchants. This blending of professional trade and domestic exchange made the market feel less like an imposed commercial event and more like a communal adaptation. The social aspect of these markets was not to be underestimated. People who lived miles apart, separated by river or road, might not see one another for months except at such a market. News traveled quickly across the ice who had married, who had fallen ill, which lord was rumored to be raising taxes. Even when no purchase was made, these conversations had value. In a season when isolation could weigh heavily, the frozen market was a rare point of contact. When the thaw came, and it always did, came with a mixture of relief and regret. Shallow depressions where boots had once stood, sellers packed quickly, wary of being caught midstream. In the days after, there would be stories: who sold out their stock just in time, who had to abandon goods, who slipped into the icy shallows and was hauled out by a neighbor. And then the market vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The river resumed its role as a barrier, and trade returned to the slower, more predictable patterns of ferries, bridges, and land routes. The memory of the frozen market became another thread in the fabric of winter life, an unpredictable gift of the season. Neither fully trusted nor entirely forgotten. In the centuries to come, such markets would give way to more organized frost fairs in some regions, complete with games, food stalls, and printed souvenirs. Temporary answer to a very old question: how do you keep trade moving when the roads and the water both stop? Its answer was simple: stand where the water used to flow, trade quickly, and keep one eye on the sky. Yet for all its ingenuity, this form of winter commerce relied entirely on the deep cold. And that raises the next question in our journey: how did medieval people keep themselves warm enough to work, trade, and survive in the longest months of the year? Story 3: Wool, Fur, and Layer upon Layer. The clothing of a medieval winter. When winter arrived in the medieval world, the first line of defense against the cold wasn't a roaring fire or a sturdy roof, it was the clothing on your back. Unlike today, where central heating and synthetic insulation soften the bite of January, medieval people lived in unheated rooms, walked along wind-whipped streets, and worked outdoors for hours at a time. The warmth you carried with you was often the only warmth you had. That warmth began with the first layer, the base garments worn closest to the skin. Across much of Europe, the most common base material was linen. Linen, made from the flax plant, had the virtue of being durable, breathable, and easy to wash, an important point in an era when laundering thick woolens was a laborious, risky task. In the depths of winter, a linen shirt or shift provided not heat in itself, but a smooth layer to keep coarser outer fabrics from rubbing the skin raw. These base garments varied in style according to gender, region, and social class. Men typically wore a long linen shirt that reached mid-thigh or lower, with fitted sleeves that could be tucked under additional layers. Women wore longer linen shifts, often to the ankle, allowing them to serve as both underclothing and nightwear. The garments were rarely pure white linen, tended to yellow over time, and bleaching was a costly process, but they were valued for their cleanliness. In some households, an extra layer of linen was added in winter, a second shirt, or a sleeveless undertunic, to trap more air close to the body. Over the linen came the first real insulation. Wool was the backbone of medieval winter clothing. Unlike linen, wool fibers have a natural crimp, creating tiny air pockets that trap heat. Even when damp, a common hazard in sleet or melting snow, wool could retain much of its insulating power. Sheep's wool varied in texture and warmth, depending on the breed and region. In areas like England and Flanders, where fine wool production flourished, the cloth could be woven densely for warmth without excessive bulk. In colder, rural areas, thicker, coarser wool was more common, ideal for heavy cloaks or work clothes. The basic woolen garment for men was the tunic, cut to mid-thigh or knee, sometimes belted at the waist. For women, it was the gown or kirtle, usually ankle-length and fitted enough to layer beneath a heavier overgown. These garments were not light. A thick winter tunic, especially when made of fulled wool, deliberately shrunk and thickened in processing, could weigh several pounds. Color was a matter of means. The poor wore undyed wool in shades of cream, brown, or gray, taken directly from the sheep's fleece. Wealthier people could afford dyed fabrics, deep blues from woad, soft greens from weld and woad combinations, and, for the truly wealthy, rich reds from imported madder or cochineal. But in winter, even the wealthy sometimes chose darker, more practical colors to hide the inevitable grime of snow and mud. One of the less glamorous truths of medieval winter, where was its bulk? Layering was the only reliable way to create real warmth. So even on short trips, people might wear 2 or 3 tunics or gowns at once. Mobility was sacrificed for insulation. Bending, kneeling, or lifting became slower, more deliberate movements. Beneath all this warmth started from the feet up. Medieval shoes, even for the wealthy, were rarely insulated. They were often made of simple leather, sometimes lined with fur for those who could afford it, but more often simply worn with thick woolen hose. Woolen leg coverings were not quite socks as we think of them, nor trousers. They were cut to fit the leg closely, tied to a belt or the waistband of a tunic, and often worn in pairs, one for each leg. In deep cold, an extra pair might be added beneath, the layers stiffening slightly where the wool was thickest. For the working poor, keeping feet dry was as important as keeping them warm. A leather shoe filled with straw could provide surprising insulation, the straw trapping heat and absorbing moisture. This was a technique known from Scandinavia to the Alps, and it persisted for centuries. Straw was easy to replace, so it could be changed daily. When dampness crept in, it was the head, however, that often determined comfort outdoors. A simple linen coifa, snug-fitting cap tied under the chin was a common underlayer worn by men. women and children alike. It kept hair contained, ears covered, and heat from escaping. Over the coif, a woolen hood could be drawn up, with a long tail, known as a liripipe, dangling behind. The hood might be part of a larger garment, like a cloak, or separate, allowing it to be worn indoors when the air was chill. For many, the base winter wardrobe was the same year after year, repaired rather than replaced. Patches were normal, often made from whatever cloth was available. A tunic might bear sleeves of a different fabric from its body. A pair of hose might have knees reinforced with coarser wool. These mismatches were not fashion statements. They were simply the mark of garments too valuable to discard. And yet, for all the practicality of these clothes, they were far from perfect. Once wet wool took time to dry, and in an unheated room, that might mean putting on slightly damp garments the next morning. Linen, while easier to clean, offered little warmth by itself. Winter clothing was a careful balance between protection and weight, warmth and the ability to move. It's worth imagining for a moment what this felt like. The heaviness of the clothes pulling at your shoulders. The faint scratch, of course. Wool at the neck. The sharp, clean smell of frost on the fabric when you stepped outdoors. In a medieval winter, you didn't dress for comfort, you dressed to survive the day. But what about those who could afford more than mere survival? How did the wealthy of the Middle Ages shield themselves from the cold while still displaying their status? If the first layer of medieval winter clothing was about survival, the second and third layers, especially among the wealthy, were about survival with style. For nobility and prosperous townsfolk, winter presented not only the challenge of keeping warm but also the opportunity to signal rank, wealth, and taste. Clothing was as much a social statement as a physical necessity. A nobleman or lady in the depths of winter did not simply pile on extra woolen tunics. Their garments were carefully tailored, richly lined, and often weighed down by decoration. The warmth came not from improvisation, but from deliberate investment layers, planned and sewn for the season. Overlands, surcoats, and houpilandism. The upper classes, the mid-layer, might be a finely tailored woolen gown, closely fitted to the body, and sometimes lined entirely with fur. Over this came the surcoata, sleeveless or short-sleeved overgarment that added warmth and created space. To display fine fabrics, in the 14th and 15th centuries, this evolved into the houppelande, a voluminous robe with wide, trailing sleeves and a high collar, which could be lined with the most luxurious furs available. The houppelande's sweeping folds did more than keep out the cold. They signaled that the wearer did not need to perform manual labor. Wide sleeves would snag on tools or get in the way of fieldwork, but in the candlelit halls of the nobility, they simply brushed against polished tables or stone floors. The houppelande was a declaration: I am warm because I am wealthy. The prestige of fifwil was the common shield against the cold. Fur was the aristocrat's armor. Fur provided unmatched insulation, and in medieval Europe, the type of fur you wore said as much about your status as the quality of your tableware or the size of your manor. The most prestigious fur was squirrel fur, taken from the winter. Coats of northern squirrels, pale on the belly and blue-gray on the back. It was sewn into a distinctive alternating pattern and used to line cloaks, mantles, and ceremonial garments. Vair was so associated with nobility that it appears in medieval heraldry. Winter stoat, with black-tipped tails, was another high-status fur, used for coronation robes and the mantles of judges and bishops. Its association with purity and authority made it an ideal choice for winter court appearances, though it was far more common in ceremonial wear than everyday dress. For less formal winter clothing, the wealthy might choose marten, beaver, or fox. Beaver fur was particularly prized for its ability to repel water, making it ideal for hats and cloaks worn in sleet or snow. Fox provided deep warmth, though its bulk limited mobility. The expense of fur lay not only in the rarity of certain animals, but in the labor required to prepare it. Skins had to be cleaned, softened, and stitched into linings or trim. A fur-lined gown might require the pelts of dozens of animals, each carefully matched in color and texture. The wealth displayed in such a garment was obvious before the wearer spoke a word. Winter footwear for the elite in an era before waterproof rubber soles. Keeping feet dry and warm was an enduring challenge. The wealthy could afford boots made of supple leather, lined with fur, or padded with layers of felted wool. Some winter boots extended well up the calf, with decorative lacing or toggles. These boots might be dyed rich colors, reds, deep greens, or blues, and fastened with fine metal buckles. Indoors, however, nobility often wore soft leather slippers or cloth shoes. Fires were rare in the center of great halls, and even the most luxurious stone-floored chambers could be cold, so these indoor shoes might also be the comfort was less about protecting from the snow outside than from the chill that seeped up through the floor. Head and neck protection for the nobility. Hoods were often as decorative as they were functional. A lady might wear a fur-lined hood, trimmed with decorative embroidery, or layer it over an elaborate headdress. Men might choose a chaperona hood with the liripipe wrapped stylishly around the head like a turban, creating a fashionable but warm head covering. In deep cold, a high collar lined with fur could be turned up to protect the neck and chin. Scarves, though less common than today, existed in the form of long strips of cloth or fur stoles, which could be draped around the shoulders. Indoor comfort, heated clothing. Medieval style, while heating entire rooms was impractical. Some nobles made use of heated stones wrapped in cloth or foot warmers, wooden boxes filled with hot embers to provide localized warmth. But the most portable heat came from the clothing itself. Wealthy households might commission quilted garments with layers of wool or cotton batting sewn between fabric layers. These quilted coats could be worn indoors in drafty chambers or under cloaks for travel. For ladies, a long fur-lined overgown could double as a bedrobe, allowing them to move from unheated corridors to their bedchambers without shivering. For men, a similar robes, sometimes called a chamber gown, served the same purpose. A practical display of excess there is an irony in medieval winter fashion among the elite. The bulk and warmth of the garments meant that noble gatherings in winter were filled with heavily layered figures, often seated for hours in poorly heated halls. While the garments projected wealth, they could also make movement awkward, require servants to assist with dressing, and trap so much heat that once indoors, the wearer might begin to sweat. Yet this layering was also practical. Noble travel in winter weather for hunting, pilgrimage, or politics meant long hours in open carriages or on horseback. Cloaks might be doubled with an inner and outer lining, and hoods drawn low over the face. Gloves were thick and often fur-lined. Though dexterity suffered, the wealthy could afford such compromises. The poor could not. For peasants and laborers, layering was a matter of necessity, not fashion, and the materials available to them were far more limited. So how did those who worked in the fields, without the furs, dyes, and tailored garments of the upper classes? If noble wardrobes were a layered statement of status and comfort, the clothing of the medieval peasant was an exercise in practicality born from necessity. The working poor faced the same winters as the wealthy, sometimes harsher still, as they spent more time outdoors, yet their clothing choices were constrained by cost, availability, and the need for mobility in labor. The daily challenge was simple: how to stay warm enough to keep working without becoming weighed down or losing the ability to move freely. The solutions were rarely elegant, but they were born of resourcefulness. The foundation, the shirt and braisefur, most peasants. The first layer was the same in winter as in summer, a loose linen shirt, undyed or bleached to a dull off-white, and brise short or knee-length linen undergarments. Linen, though cooler than wool, was preferred for underlayers because it absorbed sweat and could be washed more frequently in winter. These base layers might be worn thicker or doubled, but most peasants owned only 1 or 2 shirts at a time, so layering was often a luxury. The woolen tunic over the linen came the mainstay of medieval peasant dress. The woolen tunic, woven from the coarse wool of local sheep. These tunics were sturdy, heavy, and often itchy. For warmth, they could be belted at the waist to trap air underneath or left loose for better range of movement. Winter tunics were usually longer, sometimes reaching the knees or mid-calf. This extra fabric kept the thighs warmer, but also risked getting muddy or wet. So many peasants tucked or belted them up when working in snow or slush. Dyeing was rare for work clothes, so most peasant tunics were in shades of brown, gray, or dull green, the natural colors of untreated wool. However, in regions where woad or madder dye was locally produced, faded blues and reds occasionally appeared, especially for Sunday or festival clothing. Outer protection, cloaks and mantles. The outermost winter layer for peasants was often a simple cloak or mantle made from thick wool. These cloaks were rectangular or semicircular, fastened with a wooden or bone pin at the shoulder or front. Unlike the fur-lined cloaks of the wealthy, these were unlined and heavy. Their chief advantage was versatility. They could be wrapped around the shoulders, pulled over the head like a hood, or even used as a blanket at night. Some were waxed or treated with animal fat to repel rain or snow, though this made them smell unpleasant when damp, taut head coverings. Warm head covering was essential for outdoor work in winter. Men often wore coifs, close-fitting linen caps under woolen hoods. Women might wear linen head coverings topped with a woolen hood or simple cap. These hoods extended down over the shoulders and chest, doubling as a form of scarf. For the poorest, a hood might be the only piece of clothing they owned that was replaced regularly, since it was exposed to constant wear and weather. Hands and feet, the weak points keeping extremities warm, was one of the hardest challenges for peasants. Gloves were not standard, especially for manual labor, where they restricted movement. In bitter weather, Workers might wrap their hands in strips of wool or felt, but these offered limited dexterity. Footwear varied by region and wealth. The lucky wore leather ankle boots, sometimes stuffed with wool or straw for insulation. Many poorer peasants relied on turnshoes, thin leather shoes that wore out quickly, or went barefoot inside the home, saving shoes for outdoor work to combat cold and damp. Peasants sometimes stuffed shoes with dry grass or moss, a simple but effective form of insulation that could be replaced daily. Garments were patched, mended, and resewn until they were little more than a collection of repairs. A good woolen tunic might serve a man for a decade or more, passing through several owners in a household before being cut down into children's clothes or work rags. Seasonal adaptation meant adding removable layers rather than replacing clothing. In winter, this might mean sewing extra wool panels inside a tunic or wearing 2 cloaks at once. Community and clothing. In many rural villages, clothing was not strictly individual property. Neighbors might lend or trade garments, especially in the coldest months. A shepherd might borrow an extra cloak from a family member when tending flocks overnight, returning it when the weather improved. In some areas, church or manorial lords distributed old clothing to tenants as part of charity obligations, especially after a death in the household of a noble or wealthy merchant. These cast-offs, while worn, could provide a peasant with a rare fur trim or a slightly finer weave of wool. Special winter work garments. Some winter labor required specialized protection. Fishermen working in icy rivers might wear multiple wool tunics under oiled leather coats. Woodcutters bundled themselves in heavy cloaks for the walk to the forest, then shed layers as they worked. In regions with severe winters, such as Scandinavia or the Alps, sheepskin coats were more common among rural people. These were heavy and stiff, but exceptionally warm, with the fleece turned inward. Surviving the season. Despite these measures, winters were punishing. Clothing could only do so much when combined with inadequate shelter and food. Frostbite was not unknown, particularly on ears, fingers, and toes. The poor often worked with cold-numbed hands, and respiratory illnesses spread rapidly in underheated, crowded homes. Yet resilience was built into the rhythm of the seasons. Peasants accepted the hardship of winter as part of life, drawing on a mix of layered wool, improvised insulation, and sheer endurance. Clothing, though simple, was one of the few defenses they could control in a season when nature allowed little comfort. The medieval winter wardrobe, whether noble or peasant, was a mirror of society itself, stratified, practical at its core, but always shaped by wealth and access. In the same cold wind, one might find a fur-lined houppelande brushing the cobblestones, and not far away, a patched wool tunic stiff with frost. The differences were stark, but the goal was the same: to make it through until the first thaw. And so the barrels emptied, the shelves thinned, and the cycle began again. The medieval winter keeper's work never truly ended, only paused as the earth renewed itself. In every village, the lessons of patience, careful planning, and quiet endurance were carried forward, waiting for the next turn of the year.